My phone vibrated against the marble counter while I brushed my teeth, the sharp buzzing cutting through the quiet hum of the bathroom fan. I glanced at the screen and saw Evan's name glowing in the dim light. Not a text. A voicemail. That alone made my chest tighten. Evan hated leaving voicemails. Said they were outdated. Pointless. I rinsed my mouth, wiped my hands, and pressed play. His voice came through rough, cold, and nothing like the man I had kissed goodbye that morning. Get out. I don't need you anymore. My hand froze midair, droplets of water slipping down my wrist. Before I could process the words, another sound followed, the faint ping of an attachment downloading automatically. Then, just before the message ended, his voice returned, lower now, edged with accusation. You took what wasn't yours. For a long moment, I just stood there staring at my reflection, foam still clinging to the corner of my mouth. I didn't even recognize the woman looking back at me. Up until that night, I believed our life was steady. Not perfect, but steady enough to feel safe. I was 32, working from home as a freelance bookkeeping consultant, managing accounts for small businesses across Raleigh. Numbers made sense to me. Patterns made sense. People, most of the time, did too. Evan built houses, flipped properties, talked fast and dreamed big. He hated paperwork. Always had. That part of our marriage naturally fell into my hands. Bank statements, tax folders, digital receipts. I handled it all while he focused on deals and renovations. I thought that balance meant trust. But earlier that evening, standing in the kitchen beneath the harsh yellow light, something shifted. I had asked him about a transfer. Not angrily, not accusing, just curious. A series of small payments had appeared in his business records, sent to names I didn't recognize. I showed him the screen, expecting an explanation. Instead, his face hardened. Why are you digging through my stuff? He snapped, voice rising so suddenly it made me step back. It's not digging, I said, trying to stay calm. I organize everything. You asked me to. He didn't answer. He just grabbed his keys and walked out, the front door slamming hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. And now this voicemail. Get out. You took what wasn't yours. I replayed it once. Then again, listening carefully this time. He didn't sound drunk. Didn't sound emotional. He sounded deliberate, like he had planned every word. The attachment icon still blinked on my screen, waiting to be opened. I didn't touch it. Instead, I typed a single word into the message box. Okay. No explanation. No argument. Just that. Then I moved. Not frantically. Not crying. Quietly. Methodically. I pulled a small bag from the closet and packed only what mattered: my laptop, my phone charger, my notebook, and the external hard drive I always kept nearby. My hands moved steadily, even though my chest felt tight enough to crack. Something inside me had already decided. If he wanted me out, I would leave before he came home and turned this into something louder, uglier, harder to control. Before closing the laptop, I hesitated. The memory of those strange transactions surfaced again. The unfamiliar names, the repeated amounts, the way his voice had sharpened when I asked about them. Something didn't feel right. So I opened his financial folders one last time and copied several files into a new folder on my drive. Not everything, just the ones that made my instincts twitch. The ones my professional gut told me not to ignore. I labeled the folder simply, Personal Backup, just in case. When I finally stepped outside, the night air felt colder than it should have. The street was quiet, the neighborhood still. I locked the front door and stood there for a moment, holding the keys in my hand longer than necessary. That house had always felt safe. Until now. As I turned to walk toward my car, my eyes lifted automatically toward the small security camera mounted above the garage. And that's when I noticed it. The tiny indicator light was off. It was never off. Not once since Evan installed it. A slow chill crept down my spine as I stared at the dark, lifeless lens. For the first time that night, I realized this wasn't just about a fight. Something had already started, long before I walked out that door. Lydia opened the door before I even knocked a second time, like she had been standing there waiting for me. Her eyes moved quickly over my face, my hands, the small bag hanging from my shoulder. "You look like something followed you," she said quietly. I forced a small breath through my nose and glanced behind me down the empty hallway. Nothing but dim lighting and silence. Still, my shoulders stayed tight as I stepped inside. Lydia locked the door immediately, sliding the deadbolt into place with a firm click that echoed louder than it should have. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice sounded thinner than usual. She didn't answer right away. She just watched me, arms folded, the way she used to when I was younger and trying to lie my way out of trouble. "Sit," she said. I lowered myself onto her couch, finally letting the weight of the night settle into my bones. That was when I looked at my phone again. The screen lit up with notifications stacked one after another. 47 missed calls. My throat tightened as I scrolled through them. Most were from Evan. Call after call, only minutes apart, like he had been pacing the house, dialing again and again. But 3 of them weren't his. Unknown numbers, all placed after I left the house. A new message appeared as I stared at the screen. From Evan. "We have a big problem." No explanation. No anger this time. Just panic bleeding through the words. Another message followed seconds later. "Did you open the files?" I frowned, staring at the sentence like it was written in another language. I hadn't opened anything. Not the attachment. Not the folder. Nothing. "Something's wrong," Lydia said, watching my face. I handed her the phone without speaking. She read the messages, her mouth tightening slightly. "You didn't leave because of a fight," she said. "You left because something scared you." I shook my head slowly. "He thinks I took something. I don't even know what he means." Her eyes narrowed. "What exactly did he accuse you of stealing?" The question hit harder than I expected. I hadn't answered that myself yet. Before I could respond, my mind slipped back to something I hadn't told her. Weeks earlier, I had been sorting through Evan's property files late at night, building a clean digital record of everything he owned. Page after page of addresses, deeds, transfer logs. Then one address had stopped me cold. Not because it was unfamiliar. Because it wasn't. It was the small white house on Cedar Ridge Road, the house I grew up in before my mother sold it years ago. I had stared at the screen for a long time that night, wondering why my childhood home was buried inside my husband's business records. Back in Lydia's living room, my phone vibrated in my hand again. Unknown number. I hesitated for half a second before answering. "Hello?" Silence filled the line, thick and heavy. Then a man's voice spoke, low and steady. "You should have stayed out of it." The call ended before I could breathe out. I lowered the phone slowly, my fingers suddenly cold. Lydia stepped closer. "What did he say?" I swallowed. "He told me I should have stayed out of it." Her expression hardened instantly. She moved to the window, pulling the blinds tighter, then checked the door again like she expected someone to try it. "You're not ignoring that," she said firmly. "We're not pretending this is normal." My chest felt tight again. But this time it wasn't confusion. It was fear beginning to take shape. Slowly, I reached into my bag and pulled out the external drive I had packed earlier. "If something's wrong," I said, my voice quieter now, "it's probably in here." I connected the drive to Lydia's laptop, my hand steady even though my pulse hammered against my throat. The folder appeared on the screen. Personal backup. I clicked it open. Inside sat another folder I didn't remember creating. Transfer, final phase. A cold wave slid through my chest as I opened it. The first document filled the screen, lines of legal text stretching downward. My eyes skimmed quickly until they stopped at the center of the page. My full legal name stared back at me, positioned as primary beneficiary. My breath caught halfway in, because beneath my name sat a signature that looked almost exactly like mine. But I knew, without a doubt, I had never signed that document. Daniel Reeves didn't speak for nearly a full minute after I placed the printed documents in front of him. The quiet inside his office felt heavier than the shouting from the night before. Lydia sat beside me, arms crossed, while Daniel flipped slowly through the pages, his eyes sharp behind thin-framed glasses. Finally, he removed the glasses and set them carefully on the desk. "This isn't business paperwork?" he said. My stomach tightened. He tapped the second page with his finger. "This is liability redirection." I frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said calmly, "someone moved ownership responsibility into your name." The words didn't fully land at first. I leaned forward, scanning the document again, tracing my name where it appeared again and again across different pages. "That can't be right," I said. "I didn't sign any of this." Daniel slid the paper closer to me and pointed to the signature line. "Did you authorize any of these transfers?" "No," I answered immediately. "Never." He nodded once. Slowly, like he had already expected that answer. "These properties were transferred under your identity," he explained. "If those properties fail, if the loans default or the projects collapse, you become legally responsible." The room seemed to tilt slightly, like the floor beneath my feet had shifted without warning. Lydia leaned forward. "You're saying she could be stuck paying for his deals?" Daniel didn't soften his tone. "Yes." A cold wave crept through my chest as the realization settled into place. This wasn't just about marriage anymore. This wasn't about arguments or pride. This was survival. My mind drifted back without warning. 6 months earlier, sitting on our couch, Evan had handed me a stack of paperwork with a smile. "You're better with numbers than I am," he had said, laughing lightly. "Just help me keep everything organized." I remembered how proud I felt in that moment. Trusted, valued, important to his success. Now that memory tasted bitter. Back in Daniel's office, he leaned forward again. "You said someone called you last night?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "An unknown number. He told me I should have stayed out of it." Daniel's expression sharpened instantly. "That confirms something." "What?" Lydia asked. "That someone knows you found these records?" The words settled heavily between us. Daniel reached for another folder and pulled out a thin document. "We need to protect you immediately," he said. "That means securing evidence and creating a legal barrier around your identity." I swallowed, trying to steady my breathing. "What do I need to do?" "Sign this," he said, sliding a form toward me. "Temporary legal protection. It won't solve everything, but it buys you time." The pen felt heavier than it should have as I picked it up. My name looked different when I wrote it this time. More deliberate. More careful. For the first time since hearing that voicemail, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. After I signed, Daniel nodded once. "Now check your shared accounts," he said. "We need to know what's left." I pulled out my phone and logged in, my fingers moving faster than my thoughts. The screen loaded, and the balance appeared. My breath caught. Almost everything was gone. Transferred out. Drained. Lydia leaned closer. "How much is left?" I scrolled through the accounts, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then I stopped. One account still showed a balance. Untouched. I stared at it, recognition sparking in my mind. That account had been opened years ago under my freelance business, separate from Evan's projects. He barely remembered it existed. A slow realization spread through me, pushing back against the panic that had been building since the night before. He moved everything he thought mattered, but he forgot the one place he never believed I controlled. And for the first time since that voicemail played, I realized I wasn't completely powerless anymore. My phone began vibrating before the sun had fully risen, the low hum against Lydia's kitchen table pulling me out of a shallow, restless sleep. I reached for it without thinking, my fingers already tense before I even saw the screen. 47 missed calls, all from Evan, the same number staring back at me again and again, stacked in a desperate line that stretched across the screen. The man who told me to get out only hours earlier was now calling like his life depended on it. Another voicemail arrived while I watched. I pressed play. His voice came through shaky this time. Nothing like the cold command from the night before. "We have a big problem," he said. A breath followed. Uneven. Strained. "Natalie, you need to call me back. Please. This is serious. Please." I had never heard that word from him like this before. I sat there quietly for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. No panic this time. No confusion. Just a strange calm spreading slowly through my chest. I typed one short reply. "We'll meet." Then I added the address of Daniel's office. Not our house. Not somewhere private. Somewhere controlled. Evan agreed almost immediately. When I walked into Daniel's conference room later that morning, Evan was already there, pacing in tight circles like an animal trapped in a cage. His hair was messy, his face pale, dark circles under his eyes. He looked smaller somehow, like the confidence had drained right out of him overnight. "Natalie," he said when he saw me, stepping forward too quickly. Something went wrong. The investors pulled out. They're reviewing everything. There's talk of an audit. Daniel remained seated, calm as ever. "That audit has already begun," he said evenly. "Multiple property transfers were flagged overnight." Evan's jaw tightened. He looked at me, then back at Daniel, panic flickering across his face. "This wasn't supposed to happen," he muttered. I didn't speak right away. Instead, I opened the folder in my hands and slid the printed documents across the table. "I filed protective notice this morning," I said quietly. Evan blinked. "What?" "All transfers connected to my name are frozen," Daniel confirmed. "No assets can be moved without legal review." For a second, Evan just stared, the meaning settling slowly into his expression. "You froze everything?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. I nodded once. Silence filled the room. Then his shoulders dropped, and the fight seemed to leave him all at once. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said hoarsely. "I thought I could fix it before anyone noticed." I studied his face, searching for the man I thought I knew. The man who once told me we were building a future together. "You told me to get out," I said finally. My voice stayed steady, softer than he expected. So I stepped back and I saw everything clearly. He didn't answer. There was nothing left for him to say. Outside the office, the morning sunlight felt warmer than it had the night before. I walked slowly down the steps, breathing in deeply, feeling something shift inside me that hadn't moved in years. Not fear, not anger, control. For the first time since that voicemail echoed through my bathroom, I understood something important. Leaving wasn't weakness. It was survival. Knowledge wasn't revenge. It was protection. And sometimes, the strongest move you can make is walking away before the truth buries you. If you've ever trusted someone who hid the truth from you, I'd love to hear what you would have done in my place. Tell me in the comments, would you have stayed or walked out like I did? And if stories like this remind you how powerful knowledge and quiet strength can be, stay here with me. There are more stories coming. Stories where the truth turns the tables when no one expects it. Don't forget to subscribe, so you never miss the next time silence becomes the strongest form of revenge.